Mare Nostrum, our sea. Two countries, two continents. This Mediterranean Sea separates them, but an unmistakable family resemblance joins them in time and space. A geographical, ecological, and cultural bridge has enabled the south of Spain and the north of Morocco to have embarked on a permanent and secular two-way journey. The Strait of Gibraltar emerged approximately 5 million years ago, giving rise to the rupture of what had been a single territory for a much longer period. Since then, a stretch of sea has acted as a hinge between two practically symmetrical territories. In the year 2006, UNESCO declared these high environmental and cultural value areas Biosphere Reserve, the first between two continents. Under the Roman Empire and throughout a centuries-old shared history, the building of neighboring common identities and cultures commenced in this part of the Mediterranean. Neighbors with the same gestures, the same gaze. We recognize those faces because they are also ours. Only the outfit and the age remind us of which side of the shore we are on. This framework of people and places has been declared by UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, the highest international recognition conferred to an ecosystem, where nature and man can come to live in harmony. The aim is to boost agreements and economies in favor of the environment, a commitment that will enable the new generations to steer their lives towards a more committed future. This is a prime opportunity to forget political boundaries and to move towards conservation and sustainable development in the south of Andalusia and north of Morocco. Everything begins with water, and we owe everything to it. The steep mountains of the reserve have the highest annual rainfall of both countries. Rain that soaks these slopes, which are far too difficult to access for human settlement. In the only flat area found halfway up the mountainside lie the white villages of Andalusia, such as Grazalema. In the Sierra de Grazalema, cattle raising has been the local economic engine since time immemorial. A sheep or beef legacy from the first lineage of domestic cattle still pasturing on these mountain ranges. In the dairy products, the local economies combine ancestral know-how with new technologies and production methods to elaborate their cheeses. The preservation and promotion of these traditional industries is one of the objectives of the new Intercontinental Reserve. These heights are home to one of the biggest treasures, the pin sapo, an exclusive fruit tree from the Spanish peninsular south and north of Morocco. Its international protection began in 1977, when the Sierra de Grazalema was declared the first Spanish Biosphere Reserve. The fauna is also cross-border. We can find practically the same species in the same habitats. This animal wealth is combined with the importance of the strait as a vital migratory bridge for birds that move between the two continents. The geological past and the Mediterranean climate have produced very similar landscapes in this vast territory that spreads between the two countries. The humid bastion nature, a magnet for frequent rain and fog, combined with the characteristics of the limestone, has made these mountains an authentic water reservoir, an indispensable natural resource here. Water that soaks the earth and is always available for the population. The fountains flow from the very bowels of the mountain. They are and have been stone witnesses of an efficient ancestral water network, supplying the villages of Andalusia and those of the Rif Mountains of Morocco. Here, the water has been of inspiration to many architectural projects, like the design of the traditional infrastructures for obtaining, conducting, and distributing it to the villages. We can also see this in social gathering places. We can see this in Chefchaouen, a sea of roof terraces hanging from a mountain slope, on the only respite of the escarpment. In Grazalema, the roof tiles shelter a very similar architecture. These facades combine Arab features with Jewish and Andalusi influences, pouring their cultural past in every corner, in every street. The 11th to 13th centuries saw a continuous interchange between Andalusia and Morocco, sowing the seeds of a new culture, the Andalusi culture, one of the most outstanding in the Mediterranean. After the conquest of Granada in 1492, consecutive groups of Al-Andalus population, forced to leave their land, emigrated to Morocco, where this legacy flourished and consolidated. The urban fabric of the white villages is not the only element that conjures common echoes. The wool industry in Grazalema was very prominent in the 18th century. The blankets and woolen cloths made by craftsmen were highly valued in that period. After a long period of decadence, attempts are now made to recover the old splendor of the textile craftsmanship of Grazalema, preserving the traditional elements of its factories alongside more modern technologies. This wool has a major added value as a result of the natural wash that it gets under the abundant rainfall of the Andalusian and Rif Mountains. In Chefchaouen, the traditional wool industry is thriving. The wool is used for making thick carpets and blankets in the centuries-old tradition. Artisan workshops like these remind us of the ultimate objective of a biosphere reserve, supporting traditional activities that are in harmony with the environment from where the raw materials are extracted. A sustainable balance. The land offers many products that are very similar on both shores: wool, dairy products, honey, oil. A long but not endless list, as we must place a rational limit on how we exploit it. Thanks to the Mediterranean climate and the barrier effect that stops the clouds from drifting away, the Rif Mountains are the greenest and most wooded in Morocco, with skies swollen with clouds and crests hammered by the wind. Like in the mountains of Cádiz and Málaga, the national park of Talasemtan is home to ancient vegetation. Its Moroccan firs are first cousins of the Spanish firs. Human beings have also had to adapt to the harshness of these mountain ranges. People have created an agricultural landscape dotted with isolated and scattered villages on the folds of the mountains, arranged like stars in the sky, according to an old Berber saying. A landscape which, a little further down, is a humid garden where the best of the Mediterranean forest flourishes. In the Rif, the forests are not cleared to open the way for meadows. Unlike the Iberian Peninsula, holm oaks and cork oaks are not domesticated to shelter agriculture or pork and beef livestock. The foothills provide a good home for the goats, which feed on this exclusive vegetation whilst boosting the local economy. In the Andalusian Serranía de Ronda, the goats are also responsible for feeding on the Mediterranean mountains, oblivious of the botanical value of some of the species that live a little further up. The Spanish firs of the Sierra de las Nieves are the largest and oldest in Spain. On the most inaccessible crests, their trunks rise like gray vegetation markers deformed by the snow and the harshness of the winter, giving the landscape a false, arid aspect. One of the largest Spanish firs in Andalusia is the Pinzapo de las Escaleretas. Its dimensions and age make it unique among its species. More than 3 centuries of life for this venerable elderly specimen, which has no doubt seen better times. Since the Middle Ages, the populations of both shores have lived off trades associated with the fruits of the earth. All these trades are now possibly at risk of disappearing if artisan production is not stimulated. The case of the bees is extremely worrying. The recent death of an enormous number of bees as a result of viral diseases or climate change threatens the production of honey, the survival of the bee, and the livelihood of beekeepers. One of the goals of the 21st century is to tackle new problems and recover these traditions. In the Rif, the harshness of the landscape only allows for small-scale agriculture, as the land is difficult to cultivate and does not hold many nutrients. Subsistence agriculture is extracted from any small plot of land, putting enormous pressure on natural resources. The extension of cultivated land, deforestation, and the resulting erosion are a serious problem. The population has to continue to live off the land without exhausting it. A traditional bread oven is the last step on the ladder. The abated land produces cereals which artisan hands transform into delicacies. Arabs and Berbers, Jews and Christians have contributed ingredients and techniques that have stamped the Mediterranean culinary culture with character. The productive interchanges between the two shores generated a melting pot of insights and flavors. The Iberian Peninsula received large contributions during the Muslim period, and the Maghreb integrated into and outside the kitchen the customs brought over by the Al-Andalus emigrants. The city of Chefchaouen, built during the second half of the 15th century, became practically exclusively populated by Andalusians expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. It harbors a mixture of influences in every corner of its urban area, architecture, and customs. The old part of the city looks very much like Andalusian villages, with saddle roofs, whitewashed houses, and steep, narrow alleys. In the Medina on a market day, faces that resemble those found on the other side of the strait more than those of most Maghribiyas crowd together, giving the city a marked Hispanic feel. The unmistakable Maghrib aromas of spices and olive trees are also the aromas in the south of Spain. The common culture is on the street. All this under a white cloak with a vast array of tones of blue, which was introduced by the Jews in more recent times. In the Valle del Genal, the Mediterranean mountain harbors a unique territory on Andalusian shore. Through the centuries, its inhabitants have given shape to a human, agrarian, and forest landscape geared towards local self-sufficiency, with clear similarities with the Moroccan Reef. The scattered villages on the mountains remind one of the Reef villages, in their singular architecture to its Arab origins. In autumn, the crowns of the chestnut trees stand out above the holm and cork oaks, characteristic of the hills of the Serranía de Ronda. The local people live off the chestnuts, the cork, and the vegetable gardens, and also off the olive groves. The olive tree is a Mediterranean tree also processed in the Reef since ancient times. Currently, the artisan extraction of oil in Chefchaouen is a normal activity, as well as a journey to a not-too-distant Spanish past. There was a time that working the olive grove was practically a lost practice in the Sierra de Grazalema. Today, its preservation is stimulated to ensure that it ceases to be a marginal product and becomes an excellent quality product, which is one way of reactivating this traditional and financially sustainable crop in the Mediterranean mountains among the inhabitants. As in the Sierra de Grazalema, in Chefchaouen there are olive oil mills where the olives are processed using traditional methods for domestic and local consumption. There are no cooperatives. The rational exploitation of this oil can also become a challenge for the Reef inhabitants. In the south of Andalusia lies the oldest cork oak forest in the Iberian Peninsula, the Alcornocales Natural Park. The cork oak is a tree that is perfectly adapted to survive the extreme Mediterranean climate. And it is not alone in this vast territory. It lives alongside an exceptional entourage of flora. Since time immemorial, man has exploited this climax of plant biodiversity. The corkage of the cork oaks. The extraction of the spongy external layer of the trunk is called pela, and the way it is processed has changed very little over the centuries. The nakedness of these trunks does not harm the trees in any way. The living fabric remains intact to perpetuate the vitality of the Mediterranean forest. The timber of the cork oak and the other trees of this Mediterranean mountain has also been used since the day our species settled on both shores. By recovering the artisan processing methods, we can recover the forests. We should not forget that we also share a marine space where two large masses of salt water converge. The wealth of fishing resources is another common heritage that we must manage in a sustainable way between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean shores. The North and South territories of the Strait share an extraordinary wealth of vegetation, no less than 75% of its vascular flora, which includes important endemisms and species that are very familiar to us. The forests of holm oaks and their close relatives, cork oaks, zine oaks, and Pyrenean oaks, together with pine trees and other trees and shrubs, make up a natural heritage that conjures common landscapes. The physical separation created by the strait should not distance this space for human communication. This is the moment for similarities, to enrich ourselves with our differences, of bridging the gap between two continents which, despite their different political, religious, and socioeconomic realities, look to the future together. The Intercontinental Biosfera Reserve of the Mediterranean crosses this sea in a delicate moment of its trajectory. Climate change threatens its past sea level, temperature, and salinity. Let us look after these waters as the resistant support of this Strait of Gibraltar bridge, so that history, culture, and environment may continue to flow between the shores of Europe and Africa.